Not because he had better weapons, but because he moved faster, thought faster, and wanted it more than anyone on the other side of the field. That part you might know. But here's what... While that same man was campaigns, he was also one of the world's great. He was personally prizes that helped in battery, an entire sugar out of a vegetable that still feeds a third of the world today. His own brother chose a woman over a crown rather than obey him. And when his enemies finally locked him up on a rock in the middle of the ocean, he fought his last battle without a single soldier, and he won it. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you are going to know a Napoleon Bonaparte that most history classes never got around to teaching. And I promise you, this version is so much more interesting than the one you already know.
Let's start at the beginning, right? Because context matters. Napoleon de Bonaparte was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, an island that had been French for exactly 1 year when he arrived. His family were minor nobles, which sounds impressive until you understand that in Corsican terms it mostly just meant they had a coat of arms and not a lot of money. His father managed to get him a scholarship to a military academy in Paris, and so this Corsican kid with a thick accent, speaking French as a second language, being mocked every day by the aristocratic boys around him, responded the only way he knew how. He outworked all of them. He finished a 2-year program in 1 year. He was 16. He was commissioned as an officer in the artillery before most of his classmates had stopped being homesick. Then the revolution happened, 1789. France turned itself upside down, and Napoleon, watching it all from the outside with this cold, calculating eye, saw not chaos, he saw opportunity. Not because he was a revolutionary at heart, he wasn't really. He saw something simpler. He saw a country that had just knocked out its foundations and was going to need someone strong enough to put new ones in. His moment came at Toulon in 1793. A port city had been seized by a coalition of European powers. Napoleon, 24 years old, had a plan to retake it. The senior officers thought the plan was too bold. He positioned his artillery on the heights above the harbour. It worked. Toulon fell. He was promoted to brigadier general before he was 25. Then came Italy, then Egypt, then the coup that put him in charge of France at 30 years old, and then something that doesn't get talked about enough, the decade of building that followed. The Napoleonic Code, which standardized law across France and is still the foundation of legal systems in dozens of countries today, from Belgium to Quebec to Louisiana to half of Latin America. The Bank of France, the baccalaureate, the network of schools, the concordat with the Pope that ended the religious civil war the revolution had started, the reorganization of everything, tax, law, education, administration, from the ground up. And on the battlefield, Austerlitz in December 1805 is still studied in military academies around the world. He feigned weakness on one flank, drew the enemy in, then hit them where they weren't ready. The combined Austrian and Russian armies were destroyed in a single afternoon. Jena Auerstadt in 1806 effectively ended Prussia as a military power in 2 days. By 1807, Napoleon had redrawn the map of Europe more completely than anyone since Julius Caesar. That's the story most people know. The general, the emperor, the exile, the defeat. But here's the thing. That story is maybe 30% of who this man actually was. And the other 70%, that's where it gets really, truly interesting.
Okay, so let's talk about Paris. When you walk down the Champs-Élysées today, or you cross the Pont des Arts, that beautiful iron footbridge over the Seine with all the padlocks on it, or you stand in front of the Arc de Triomphe at night when it's all lit up gold, you are standing inside something Napoleon designed. Not inspired, not influenced, designed, deliberately, with the same focused, organized intelligence he brought to military campaigns. Because here's what people forget. Napoleon didn't just want to win wars. He wanted to make Paris the capital of the world. Literally, that was the goal. And he came after it the same way he came after everything else, systematically, boldly, without apology. He commissioned the Arc de Triomphe in 1806, right after Austerlitz. He commissioned the Vendôme column, cast from 1,200 cannons captured from defeated armies as a kind of visual statement. Look what we took. Look what we turned it into. He commissioned the Church of the Madeleine, but here's the part that got quietly erased from history. It wasn't built to be a church. It was designed as a temple to the glory of the French army, a monument to military power, modeled on a Greek temple. The Bourbon Restoration turned it into a church after Napoleon fell. Most people walking past it today have no idea it was ever anything else. Beyond the monuments, he went after the city itself. He built new bridges, the Pont de Yenne, the Pont Austerlitz, the Pont des Arts. He installed a dozen public fountains, including the Fontaine du Palmier, specifically to get cleaner water to a population that had been drinking from the Seine. He expanded and modernized the sewer network, laying the groundwork for the infrastructure that would later make Paris one of the most livable cities in Europe. He organized the markets. He brought order to food distribution in a city that had almost starved within living memory. None of this was generosity, let's be clear. Napoleon approached city planning the same way he approached logistics. A city with clean water has fewer epidemics. A city with wide streets is easier to control. A city covered in monuments that say "we won" is a city where people feel pride instead of resentment. The granite he always talked about throwing on the soil of France, the foundations, the durable things, they weren't just a metaphor. They were the Pont des Arts. They were the Fontaine du Palmier, and they are still there. Now, here is a title that Napoleon Bonaparte actually held officially that almost nobody ever mentions. Member of the National Institute of France, elected 1997, class of Mechanical Arts. Not honorary, not symbolic. He sought election, he attended sessions, he participated in debates. Because the thing about Napoleon that the image of the emperor on a horse makes it easy to miss, this man genuinely loved science, as in personally, deeply, the way some people love music or sport. At military school, he had excelled in mathematics. His private journals include discussions of geometry. When he sailed to Egypt in 1798 with 35,000 soldiers, he also brought 167 scholars, scientists, mathematicians, chemists, astronomers, engineers, artists, the most concentrated deployment of scientific talent that had ever accompanied a military expedition in history. Among them were two men who became his closest scientific friends, Gaspard Monge, the mathematician who had developed a whole field of geometry and who reportedly wept with joy the first time he saw the pyramids, and Claude-Louis Berthollet, the chemist whose work on chemical reactions changed how we understand science at a fundamental level. Both of them came back from Egypt with Napoleon. Both served in his government. Both helped build the École Polytechnique into what became the world's most prestigious engineering institution. In 1801, Alessandro Volta came to Paris and demonstrated his voltaic pile, the world's first battery, in front of the Institut de France. Napoleon was in that audience. He watched the demonstration, and within days he had established a prize, the Volta Prize, funded directly from the imperial treasury, worth 60,000 francs, to be awarded to whoever made the most significant contribution to understanding electricity. 60,000 francs, that was an extraordinary amount of money. It drove a decade of intensive research that laid the foundations for the science of electromagnetism, the science that gave us everything electrical that came after. Pièce, the mathematician whose work on probability, celestial mechanics, and the mathematical structure of the universe makes him one of the most important scientists who ever lived, served government. Joked that Laplace brought the infinitely small into his administration, which honestly is one of the funniest things Napoleon ever said. Laplace was eventually made the Marquis de Laplace by the king who came after Napoleon, but the career and the recognition, those were built in the Napoleonic era. He did not fund science from a distance. He sat in the room, he argued, he engaged. He believed that French intellectual power and French military power were the same project, expressed in different languages.
March 20, 1815, Napoleon walks back into Paris. He'd escaped from the island of Elba 11 months into his first exile. He landed in the south of France with just over 1,000 men, and the army sent to arrest him joined him instead, regiment by regiment, division by division. He reached Paris without firing a single shot. It is the most audacious political comeback in European history, and it is still almost impossible to believe it actually happened. Most people know how this story ends. Waterloo, June 1815, the final defeat, the second and permanent exile. But between March and June, Napoleon did something that almost nobody talks about. He tried to become a different kind of ruler. Benjamin Constant was maybe Napoleon's most famous liberal critic. He had spent years writing that Napoleon's empire was everything the revolution had promised to destroy. He had compared Napoleon to Attila and Genghis Khan in print. Napoleon had read it. Napoleon had noted the comparison, and when he returned to Paris, he invited Constant for a private conversation. What came out of that conversation was a document signed on April 22, 1815, the Acte additionnel aux constitutions de l'Empire, drafted by Constant himself. It proposed a two-chamber parliament, guaranteed press freedom, guaranteed religious liberty, made ministers accountable to elected representatives. Napoleon, the man who had censored newspapers and built a secret police force, was now offering in writing to constrain his own power. A vote was held. It was ratified. But here's the thing that makes this story complicated. The abstention rate was massive. Millions of eligible voters just didn't show up. After revolution, terror, empire, restoration, and now empire again, all within one generation, people were exhausted. Or they didn't believe him. Or both. Constant himself, the man who had compared Napoleon to Genghis Khan, wrote in his private journal, "I have worked with him. He is a man of astonishing intelligence." The liberal empire that this document pointed toward never got to prove or disprove itself. Waterloo ended it 8 weeks later. But the document is real, the signatures are real, and the question it asks, whether a man defined by absolute power can genuinely choose to give some of it away, that question does not have a clean answer, even now.
Okay, I need to tell you about sugar, because this one genuinely surprised me. In 1806, Napoleon issued the Berlin Decree and launched what he called the Continental System, a Europe-wide blockade of British trade. The idea was that if you cut Britain off from European markets, the British economy would collapse. It didn't work. Britain had the world's most powerful navy, global trading networks, and enough creative smugglers to keep goods flowing regardless. The blockade as a weapon against Britain failed. But here is the story nobody tells about the Continental System, what it did to France. Before the Revolution, France had been supplied with cane sugar from the Caribbean, primarily from Saint-Domingue, which is Haiti today. The Haitian Revolution had already disrupted that supply. The British naval blockade cut it off almost entirely. Sugar prices in France went through the roof. Ordinary people couldn't afford it. Napoleon looked at this problem the way he looked at all logistical problems, as something to be solved by organized intelligence and state power. The science existed. A Prussian chemist named Marggraf had shown back in 1747 that you could extract sugar from beets. His student had built the world's first beet sugar factory in 1801. But without money and political will behind it, the technology had just been sitting there as an interesting idea. Napoleon changed that. In 1810, he offered a prize of 200,000 francs, an enormous sum, for improvements in beet sugar extraction. In March 1811, he issued an imperial decree making beet sugar a strategic national industry and ordering 100,000 hectares of French farmland to be planted with beet sugars. On January 2, 1812, he visited the factory of a man named Benjamin Delessert, who had refined the extraction process to the point where it actually worked commercially. Napoleon watched the demonstration, tasted the sugar, and, on the spot, removed the Legion of Honor from his own coat and pinned it to Delesert's. By the end of 1812, there were 40 beet sugar factories in France. By 1813, there were roughly 300. The industry Napoleon forced into existence in 3 years of directed policy became the foundation of the European beet sugar industry. And today, beet sugar supplies approximately 30% of all the sugar in the world, tens of billions of dollars annually, supermarkets across Europe and beyond. And it all traces back to a specific morning in 1812 when a French emperor, frustrated by a British naval blockade, decided that France was going to grow its own sweetness. That is what happens when a government actually commits to solving a problem. Not a tariff, not a complaint, a decree, a prize, a visit to a factory, a medal on a man's chest. 300 factories in 2 years. Napoleon had 4 brothers. Joseph became king of Spain, Louis became king of Holland, Jerome became king of Westphalia. The 4th brother, Lucien, never held a throne. And the reason why is one of the most human stories in this entire history. Lucien Bonaparte was, by most accounts, the most naturally gifted of all the Bonaparte siblings, genuinely republican, genuinely principled, and the man without whom the coup that put Napoleon in power would almost certainly have failed. When the coup was falling apart in November 1799, when Napoleon was being physically pushed off the podium by angry deputies, when soldiers were unsure whether to protect him or arrest him, it was Lucien who stepped forward, drew a sword, pointed it at his own brother, and declared dramatically that he would stab Napoleon through the heart himself if Napoleon ever betrayed the liberty of the Republic. The soldiers laughed, the moment broke, the coup succeeded. Napoleon owed Lucien everything. In 1800, Lucien quietly married a woman named Alexandrine de Blanchamp. She was the widow of a stockbroker, no political connections, no diplomatic value. Napoleon hadn't approved the marriage, but Lucien loved her, and for a while Napoleon let it go. Then Napoleon became emperor in 1804, and suddenly everything became about dynasty, about strategic marriages, about power and alliances arranged like pieces on a board. Napoleon needed Lucien to divorce Alexandrine and marry a European princess, specifically the Queen of Etruria, to cement an alliance with Spain. He didn't ask, he commanded. He was the Emperor of France. His brother would do what the empire required. Lucien said no, immediately, absolutely. He loved his wife, he had made vows to her, he was not a chess piece, he was not going to trade her for a throne. And Napoleon, the same man who in 1809 would divorce his own beloved Josephine, the woman he had genuinely loved, for exactly this kind of dynastic calculation, could not process the refusal. In April 1804, Lucien took Alexandrine and left for Rome. Not formally banished, not marched to the border under guard, he chose to go. And Napoleon, over time, stripped him of his Senate seat, removed his name from the imperial registers, and gave him none of the wealth and titles and kingdoms that he distributed to every other sibling with extraordinary generosity. Lucien tried to sail to America in 1810 to escape the whole situation entirely. The British Navy stopped his ship. He spent 4 years as a prisoner in England, apparently spending a good portion of that time discussing Virgil with his captors. He came back to Napoleon's side during the 100 Days of 1815, one last act of loyalty when the whole world had turned. It didn't change anything. He died in 1840, still married to Alexandrine. The marriage lasted 40 years. He chose a woman over a crown, and he never once seemed to regret it. Napoleon's official mythology has always quietly stepped over Lucien because his story doesn't fit the script. It shows that the most powerful man in Europe could not make his own brother obey him. Not because Lucien was weak, because he wasn't.
And then there is St. Helena. St. Helena is one of the most remote inhabited islands on Earth. South Atlantic Ocean, 1,200 miles from Africa, 1,800 miles from South America. The British chose it deliberately as Napoleon's final prison because the Elba situation, where he had simply sailed away from his first exile, was not going to be repeated. Napoleon arrived in October 1815. He was 46. He was assigned to a damp, fog-prone farmhouse called Longwood House on a plateau in the island's interior where it rained constantly and the rats were a persistent problem. The British governor of the island was a man named Sir Hudson Lowe, career soldier, rigid, bureaucratic, deeply uncomfortable with the situation he'd been placed in. He had never met Napoleon before the exile. He was, by the accounts of nearly everyone on the island, terrified of him. And like a lot of people who are frightened of someone they have power over, they expressed that fear through small, petty cruelties. The most visible one was the title. Lowe's instructions from London were clear. Napoleon was to be addressed as Napoleon Bonaparte. Not emperor, not general, not even Napoleon. Lowe went back to the original Corsican spelling, Bonaparte, as if to strip him of even his French identity. Napoleon, who had been addressed as Your Majesty by the kings of Europe, refused to receive any communication that didn't use his imperial title. Lowe refused to send any that did. A war of protocols conducted entirely in the address lines of letters, while the man who commanded the Grande Armée sat in a damp farmhouse on a volcanic rock in the middle of the ocean. Lowe also assigned a British officer to personally catch sight of Napoleon every single day and report his location. Napoleon found this so intolerable that he started barricading himself in his rooms, refusing to appear. The officer would report not sighted day after day. Lowe would send agitated notes. Napoleon would send back notes pointing out a package to be inventoried. But inside Longwood House, Napoleon was doing something important than arguing. He was writing. Precisely, he was talking, and his Manuel de las Casas everything down, every memory, every campaign, vision, every version of every story that Napoleon wanted history to remember. He revised as he went. He softened things that needed softening. He sharpened things that needed sharpening. He understood completely and clearly that the battlefield he was fighting on now was not a field in Belgium or Italy or Egypt. It was the future. It was the judgment of people who hadn't been born yet, and he was going to make sure they heard his version first. Lowe discovered the journals in December 1816 and expelled Las Casas from the island, but it was too late. Las Casas left with his notes intact. He published the Memoire de Saint-Hilaire in 23, 2 years after Napoleon died. It became one of the best-selling books of the entire 19th century. Victor Hugo read it, Stendhal read it, Tolstoy